Good evening, mates. Welcome to Historian's Lullaby. Tonight we will meet an extraordinary woman who changed the course of history as we know it. Some called her Mumbet, the name given to her in bondage, but history remembers her as Elizabeth Freeman. Her story is not carved in marble, nor sung in the triumphant tones of generals or kings. It is a story carried in song by firelight, a story of a woman who listened, who understood, and who refused to let words of freedom pass her by. She was born enslaved, her life bound in service to others, her days measured by the rhythm of labor. Yet she carried within her a quiet strength, a dignity that no chain could tarnish. In the heat of a kitchen, in the shadow of a doorway, she overheard words that were not meant for her. Words from the new Massachusetts Constitution, words that said all people are born free and equal. They fell upon her ears like a bell tolling in the night, startling and undeniable. Elizabeth Freeman did not let those words drift away. She caught them, held them close, and gave them weight. With courage as her only weapon, she stepped forward and demanded that the promises of liberty be honored. In doing so, she cracked the chains that bound not only her, but a people. This is her lullaby, not of silence or submission, but of freedom born from courage, a song that still echoes in the dark corners of history. Elizabeth Freeman entered the world as property. She was born around 1742 in Claverack, New York, into a life already claimed by others. Her childhood did not carry the freedom of running wild through fields or the promise of schoolbooks and games. Instead, her earliest memories would have been shaped by the press of labor, the commands of masters, and the knowledge that her body and her hours did not belong to her. As a young girl, she was carried into the household of John Ashley in Sheffield, Massachusetts. Ashley was a prominent man, wealthy and powerful, his home bustling with business, politics, and family. For Elizabeth, this house was not a place of shelter but a place of servitude. She woke before the sun, her hands already reaching for the kindling that would spark the morning fire. The smell of smoke clung to her skin, her clothes, her hair, as she crouched before the hearth, coaxing embers into flame. Her days were measured in tasks. Bread kneaded and baked until the air grew thick with the scent of yeast and ash. Floor scrubbed until her arms ached. Water hauled from wells that bit her shoulders with every heavy step. Pots and pans scoured with sand until her fingers cracked and bled. She stirred stews, roasted meats, churned butter, her body moving to rhythms set not by her own will but by the endless appetite of the household. Children tugged at her skirts, their cries demanding attention. She cradled them, fed them, soothed them, often with more tenderness than their own parents could spare. And when those children grew, they learned early to call her servant, never Elizabeth. To them she was Mumbet, which was probably shorthand for Mama Elizabeth. The house itself carried its own kind of prison. The rooms glowed with firelight, filled with the chatter of visitors, the scrape of chairs across polished floors, the murmur of political debates. John Ashley often entertained local leaders, men whose voices filled the air with lofty words about liberty and natural rights. Elizabeth served them food and drink, her face lowered, her ears open. She carried trays heavy with bread and cider into rooms where freedom was praised, all while chains bound her own life in silence. Hardship was constant. A misstep, a dropped dish or a poorly cooked meal could bring punishment. The lash of words was sharp enough, but the lash of tools or hands left deeper scars. One story says she once stepped between a mistress and another servant, shielding the girl from being struck with a hot shovel, only to receive the blow herself. She carried the wound from that moment for the rest of her life, a reminder etched into her flesh of the cruelty she endured and the defiance she chose. Yet within this world of endless labor and humiliation, Elizabeth carried something her masters could not crush. She carried resolve. Her eye saw everything, her ears gathered every word, her mind kept hold of the contradiction between the liberty spoken in the parlor and the bondage lived in the kitchen. She endured the ache of work, the sting of punishment, the exhaustion of nights cut short, but she endured with a quiet strength. Her life was one long apprenticeship in patience, resilience, and listening. What was it like to be Elizabeth Freeman? It was to wake each day in bondage, yet rise each day with a spirit that could not be bound. It was to smell the bread she baked for others while tasting only the bitterness of her own captivity. It was to rock another woman's children to sleep while knowing her own freedom had been stolen at birth. It was to carry scars on her body but also to carry words in her heart, words that would one day become the key to her deliverance. Massachusetts in the late 18th century was a land alive with contradictions. On the one hand, taverns and meeting halls buzzed with talk of liberty. Men in powdered wigs leaned across rough wooden tables, tankards in hand, declaring that no person should live under tyranny. Town greens echoed with fiery speeches, words like freedom and independence ringing out against the cold New England sky. Church bells tolled for meetings, and young soldiers drilled in muddy fields, muskets glinting in the weak sun. The air itself seemed charged with the promise of a new beginning. Yet beneath the same sky, in the same fields and kitchens, another reality endured. Enslaved men and women bent their backs to plow the earth, to tend livestock, to carry water, to serve meals. They stood silent in rooms where men proclaimed that all are born free and equal, knowing those words were not meant for them. They lived in cottages and servant quarters, the smell of smoke, refuse, and damp straw thick in the air, the weight of someone else's ownership pressing down on every moment of their lives. The contradiction was jarring, though few in power cared to see it. The rhetoric of liberty spread like wildfire, yet the hands that fanned that flame often held chains in the other. Massachusetts prided itself on learning, on faith, on civic virtue, yet within its households lived people denied the most basic dignity of choosing their own names, their own fates, their own futures. The war for independence sharpened the tension. Farmers and merchants rallied to resist taxes from a distant king, even as enslaved laborers tilled their fields and polished their boots. Muskets cracked in skirmishes against the British, while at home, women like Elizabeth Freeman carried trays of food to masters who spoke of rights and revolutions. The hypocrisy was as heavy as the fog rolling in from the Atlantic, settling over town squares where liberty was praised, and fields where liberty was denied. But in those fields, in those shadowed corners, the words still found their way. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, with its declaration that all men are born free and equal, spread beyond the halls of the powerful. It was read aloud, debated, repeated in taverns, in churches, in homes. And though it was never meant for her ears, Elizabeth Freeman heard it. Imagine the moment. The door to the hall ajar, voices carrying across polished floors, the syllables drifting like sparks toward the servants waiting in the next room. Sparks that could not be ignored. Massachusetts was a place suspended between two worlds, one straining toward freedom, the other stubbornly clinging to chains. The scent of fresh ink on parchment carried promises, but in kitchens, in stables, in fields, the smell of sweat and toil reminded everyone how far away those promises remained. Into this tension Elizabeth Freeman stepped, her heart seizing on the words that echoed so loudly against the silence of her bondage. This was the Massachusetts she knew. A land proclaiming freedom, yet teaching her every day the taste of captivity. A land that, in its contradiction, gave her the very tools she would use to break free. Only a year earlier, in 1779, and Massachusetts was restless. The Revolution was still grinding on, and the colony-turned state was determined to put its ideals into writing. The Declaration of Independence had been read aloud from town greens, muskets still cracked against British lines, and yet the people knew that words on parchment mattered. A state without a constitution was a ship without a rudder. So Massachusetts set out to create one of its own, a document that would not only declare its independence but define what freedom meant. Into this moment stepped John Adams. Sharp of mind, stern of temperament, Adams had already made his mark in Philadelphia, helping draft the Declaration of Independence. Now he returned to his home state to shape something equally enduring. Chosen to head the committee tasked with creating the new Constitution, Adams poured himself into the work. He believed in checks and balances, in strong separation of powers, in building a government sturdy enough to last. He also believed in language that carried moral force, words that spoke not only to governance but to the soul of the people. The Convention of 1779 gathered in Cambridge, delegates arguing, debating, revising by candlelight in draughty halls. They wrangled over rights, over representation, over how power should be divided. Outside, soldiers marched and farmers struggled, the revolution still uncertain, but inside, the words of the new Constitution began to take shape. At its heart was a declaration, simple and profound: all men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Those words were revolutionary not only against kings but against centuries of hierarchy. They echoed the Enlightenment, the philosophy of Locke and Rousseau, yet carried the sharp edge of America's own struggle. They were written to cut down tyranny, but they would reach further than Adams himself could have foreseen. By 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution was ratified, becoming the oldest functioning written constitution in the world. Its preamble, its Declaration of Rights, and its careful structuring of government became a model for others, even influencing the later United States Constitution. But perhaps its most powerful line was that quiet, universal promise of freedom and equality. Those words traveled far beyond the halls of Cambridge. They reached kitchens, fields, and servant quarters. They reached Elizabeth Freeman. And when she heard them, they were no longer abstract ideals. They were a summons, an invitation, a declaration meant for her as much as for the men who had written them. It happened in an ordinary instant, in the kind of moment that might have slipped by unnoticed in another life. A door was left open, or perhaps she lingered just beyond the threshold of a parlor where men sat debating. Their voices carried easily into the air, strong and certain, the words sharpened by conviction. They spoke of the new Constitution, of a declaration that rang with promise. All men are born free and equal, one voice said, steady as scripture. For Elizabeth Freeman, those words struck with the force of revelation. They were not idle chatter, they were not polite philosophy. They were a thunderclap, the kind that splits the sky and changes destiny forever. She stood where she had stood countless times before, a servant listening from the edges of the room, but something shifted inside her. The words did not glide past her ears, they rooted themselves deep within her. She had lived long enough to know the weight of chains, even invisible ones. She had seen mothers weep for children sold away, she had seen men bent double beneath burdens they did not choose. The story of bondage was as old as empire, stretching back through ships that crossed the Mediterranean and slave boats down the Nile River. Through kingdoms in Africa and among indigenous peoples in the Americas, human bodies were priced and bartered. Elizabeth carried in her very skin the history of all peoples denied their own names, their own freedom, their own dignity. And now, here, in Massachusetts, she heard men declare that no one was born to be owned. It was not an abstract principle to her. It was a promise. And unlike those who spoke the words, Elizabeth could not afford for them to remain theoretical. She had suffered under the harshness of masters, had felt punishment sear into her flesh, had labored endlessly without reward. She knew in her bones what slavery meant, and so she also knew what freedom would mean. In that moment, something solid formed in her heart. She did not have fine clothes or education, she did not have armies or wealth. What she had was the truth of those words, spoken by the powerful but only truly understood by the powerless. If the law declared that all were free and equal, then it must include her. If the promise was real, it could not be selective. She would not allow it to be selective. Her resolve did not come with fanfare. It came in silence, in the stillness of her own conviction. She carried on with her tasks, hands busy with work, face expressionless, but within her a decision had been made. She would not let the contradiction stand. She would test those words against the weight of her chains. And so the seeds of hope were sown. Not a soft, fleeting hope, but a righteous and unyielding one. Elizabeth Freeman would not be forgotten in the background of history. She would step forward, using the very language of her oppressors to break her bonds. The world had carried slavery across oceans, across deserts, through forests and over mountains, while in the process building empires. But here, in the heart of one woman, in the still of one moment, history would unravel. The late 18th century was an age of upheaval, a time when the old world cracked and new ideas rushed in like water through broken stone. Across the Atlantic, revolutions were stirring. In France, the language of liberty and fraternity was beginning to churn. In Haiti, whispers of rebellion were growing among the enslaved, voices that would soon rise into one of the fiercest revolutions the world had ever seen. The air of the age was charged with a single idea, that ordinary people could demand freedom, that birth and blood no longer had the right to chain anyone to the will of another. Massachusetts was not isolated from this current. Its sons had carried muskets at Lexington and Concord, had fought beneath banners painted with slogans of liberty. The newspapers brimmed with rhetoric borrowed from philosophers who dared to say that rights were natural, not granted by kings. Elizabeth Freeman, listening from her station in the Ashley household, was not alone in hearing something deeper. The world itself was shifting. But while men debated constitutions and monarchs trembled on their thrones, the enslaved bore the sharpest edge of contradiction. They were forced to fight in armies that promised freedom, yet returned them to bondage. They were baptized in churches that spoke of equality before God, yet sat in pews as property. Their bodies tilled soil for revolutions that did not intend to free them. Freeman, however, refused to let the hypocrisy swallow her. She understood, with a clarity sharper than most, that if liberty was to mean anything at all, it must extend to the people most denied it. In her mind, the struggle for freedom in Massachusetts, in America, even in the world, was incomplete until her own chains were broken. The revolution was not only muskets and battles. It was also a woman who had overheard a promise and decided she would claim it. In Sheffield, Massachusetts, Elizabeth Freeman lived in a world where the powerful were never out of sight. John Ashley's household was a hub of politics and law. Ashley himself was a judge, a man of influence whose home often filled with other leaders. Freeman, serving food and tending fires, heard every word. She listened as men spoke of land disputes, militia calls, and the new Massachusetts Constitution. And among those voices, one name rose again and again. Theodore Sedgwick. Sedgwick was no stranger in Ashley's orbit. He had sat at Ashley's table, argued points of law, and joined in debates about liberty. Freeman likely saw him there, not as a distant figure of authority, but as a man whose words she found attractive. He was younger than Ashley, yet sharp and ambitious, a lawyer with a reputation for clear thinking and fiery conviction. His name lingered in her memory because he was not just another voice in the chorus. He was someone who believed in the power of ideas, someone who might actually be willing to test them. And so, when the time came for her to act, when the words "all men are born free and equal" burned too brightly to ignore, she knew where to turn. She sought not only a lawyer, but a man she believed might hear her, a man who might see her as more than property. Theodore Sedgwick was born in 1746 in West Hartford, Connecticut, into a world where law and religion shaped every breath of daily life. He was raised among the stern rhythms of New England, where sermons thundered of duty and justice, and where the revolution was already brewing beneath the surface of everyday talk. From a young age, Sedgwick showed a mind sharp as a blade. He studied at Yale for a time, though he did not finish, choosing instead to apprentice in law. In the cramped offices of early America, he pored over parchment, absorbing the language of statutes and precedents until he could wield them with precision. By his 30s, Sedgwick was carving a path into public life. He had fought in the Revolution, not with musket, but with words, serving as an advocate for independence. He rose quickly as a lawyer in Berkshire County, known for his eloquence and his ability to see the heart of an argument. In courtrooms where others mired themselves in technicalities, Sedgwick struck clean and clear, appealing to principle as much as to procedure. His reputation was that of a man who carried both fire and reason, a rare combination in turbulent times. He was also ambitious. Sedgwick's eyes were always on the horizon. He would later serve in Congress, become Speaker of the House, even sit as a federal judge. But in the years when Elizabeth Freeman approached him, he was still building his name, still eager to prove himself as a lawyer of distinction. A case that could test the Massachusetts Constitution itself would have been irresistible, not only for its legal stakes but for its moral weight. What made him stand out to Freeman was not just his intellect but his presence. Sedgwick was known in Sheffield. His voice carried in taverns and town meetings, his arguments reported in hushed tones by those who had witnessed his skill. More than that, he was tied to the very men who had crafted the Constitution. He understood its spirit as well as its words, and he had the courage to test its reach. To an enslaved woman searching for a lifeline, Sedgwick was not only accessible, he was the right kind of dangerous. He was clever, ambitious, and willing to pit principle against power. He was everything she needed in an advocate, and she must have known, deep in her bones, that if freedom could be pulled from the dry ink of law, he was the one who could help her do it. The decision to act was not easy, but it was absolute. Elizabeth Freeman had no illusions about the danger. To challenge a master in court was unthinkable. Enslaved people were expected to endure in silence, to swallow their anger, to carry their scars quietly. Yet Elizabeth had already carried too much. The words of the Constitution pulsed in her heart, steady as a drum. She would not die in bondage when the law itself declared she was free. The morning Elizabeth Freeman set out to find Theodore Sedgwick, the world must have felt strangely alive. Sheffield was not a city of stone and grandeur, but a small New England town stretched across the Housatonic River, where fields pressed against forests and homes clustered along the main road. Freeman's life had been tethered to the Ashley estate, where she lived as an enslaved servant, her hours consumed by labor. But on this day, her feet carried her not in service, but in defiance. She would have walked. That was the way of most in those days, the rhythm of steps crunching along dirt roads that twisted between meadows and pastures. The air smelled of wood smoke from chimneys, the sour tang of livestock, the sweetness of hay drying in barns. Carts creaked past pulled by oxen, their drivers tipping hats or staring curiously as the woman known as Mumbet strode with uncommon purpose. The Berkshire hills loomed in the distance, blue-grey in the morning light, and the Housatonic flowed with the steady patience of a river that had seen centuries of footsteps along its banks. Freeman knew these roads well. She had travelled them to market, to gather supplies, to carry messages for her household. But today her errand was her own. Each step was heavy with meaning. She was walking toward Sedgwick's law office, a modest place but one that hummed with ideas. To Freeman it must have felt like approaching a temple of possibility, a place where the words she had overheard could be transformed into action. The road was long enough to test her resolve, but she did not falter. With every farmhouse she passed, with every crow that lifted from the fields, she reminded herself of the promise she intended to claim: freedom, not in whispers, but in law. By the time Freeman arrived at Sedgwick's office, her determination had ripened into something unshakable. Imagine her standing at the threshold, her scarred arm hidden beneath her sleeve, her back straight. She was no longer the silent servant moving unnoticed through rooms of power. She was a woman about to step into history. Theodore Sedgwick looked up from his papers, perhaps surprised to see her there. He knew her by sight. Sheffield was a small place, and Freeman had served in the Ashley household for years. Yet the way she carried herself in that moment was not that of a slave. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She told him she had heard the words of the Constitution, words declaring that all people were born free and equal, and she demanded to know why they should not apply to her. It was an extraordinary act of courage. To walk into the office of a white lawyer and insist that the law must recognize her humanity was unheard of. She was a black woman enslaved, and yet she claimed the Constitution of Massachusetts as her own. Sedgwick listened. The air between them must have felt charged, the quiet scrape of his chair, the flicker of a candle on the desk, the scent of ink and parchment mingling with the heaviness of her words. He could not dismiss her. She was not pleading. She was declaring. In that room, in that moment, Elizabeth Freeman transformed herself from property into plaintiff, from servant into seeker of justice. She had crossed the distance from Ashley's estate to Sedgwick's door, but the greater distance was within. She had stepped out of bondage and into the conviction that freedom was her human right. Elizabeth Freeman did not walk alone into history. At her side was a man named Brom, another enslaved person in the Ashley household. Brom's name rarely shines as brightly in retellings, but he was there, shoulder to shoulder, when the petition for freedom was filed. He was younger than Elizabeth, strong and steady, the kind of man whose labor would have been spent in fields, stables, and heavy work that left his back sore and his hands calloused. Where Freeman carried the scars of domestic service, Brom carried the scars of toil. He had seen the same hypocrisy, heard the same words of liberty spilling from the mouths of men who lived comfortably off the labor of others. He shared Elizabeth's hunger for something more. It is easy to imagine the conversations between them in hushed tones, perhaps at night when the fire had burned low, or in fleeting moments between chores. Elizabeth, with her scarred arm and fiery resolve, Brom with his strength and unspoken dignity, deciding together that they would not let the promise of freedom pass them by. The year was 1781. The revolution still rumbled in the distance, soldiers still marched, muskets still cracked in skirmishes. But in a small courtroom in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, another kind of battle was about to unfold. The case of Brom and Bett versus Ashley would not be fought with guns, but with words, with principle, and with the courage of two people who refused to be forgotten. Picture the room. Wooden benches lined the walls. The air smelled of sweat, parchment, and the faint tang of unwashed men. Windows let in slats of light that cut across the floorboards. Farmers and townsfolk gathered in the back, curious to see what would happen when enslaved people challenged one of the region's most powerful men. At the front, John Ashley sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. Beside him, his lawyers shuffled papers, already preparing to argue that property was property, that nothing more needed to be said. And then there were Brom and Bett. They had no fine clothes, no standing in society, no voices that usually mattered in a court of law. Yet here they were, plaintiffs, not property. Their case rested on a single line from the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Theodore Sedgwick rose to speak for them. He was calm, deliberate, his voice carrying across the room. He argued that if the Constitution was to mean anything at all, it must include Brom and Bett. If she is not free, Sedgwick said of Bett, then the Constitution itself is a lie. His words struck like a hammer against stone. Witnesses were called. Some testified to the labor Brom and Bett had given, to the years of service in Ashley's household. Others spoke of the Constitution, of its promise, of its weight as law. The jury listened. The tension was heavy, as though the entire state of Massachusetts was holding its breath within those walls. Ashley's lawyers countered, claiming property rights, claiming tradition, claiming that nothing had changed. They spoke with certainty, but their words rang hollow in a time when revolution was in the air, when liberty was the word on every tongue. How could they argue that men were born free, yet insist that some men and women must remain in chains? The contradiction was too stark, too cruel, too obvious. Sedgwick pressed harder. He reminded the jury that the revolution itself was being fought on the principle that liberty was sacred. If our fight with Britain is just, he declared, then so too is the fight of these plaintiffs. Their cause is our cause, their freedom is our freedom. Elizabeth did not speak much during the trial. She did not need to. Her presence was argument enough. She sat upright, her scar hidden beneath her sleeve, her eyes steady. Every man in that courtroom knew she had served, endured, labored, and suffered. Every man knew she bore witness to the hypocrisy of their words. She did not plead for pity. She simply embodied the truth that could not be denied. The courtroom had gone still when the jury filed out. Elizabeth and Brom sat side by side, the air heavy with waiting. Outside, the sun pressed against the windows, throwing long beams across the wooden floor, but inside the air felt close, tight, and unyielding. Each creak of the benches, each cough or whisper, seemed louder than it should. The jury's absence was a silence thick with possibility. For Elizabeth, the minutes stretched like hours. She had lived a lifetime in bondage, her body worn beyond her years, her days consumed by labor. She had endured the blows, the commands, the indignities. And now everything balanced on the words of 12 men behind a closed door. She sat upright, hands folded, her face calm, but inside her heart beat steady and fierce. She thought of her children, of the girls who had worked beside her, of every enslaved person who had never tasted a single drop of liberty. She whispered a prayer not only for herself, but for all of them. Brom sat next to her, his broad shoulders bowed slightly, his rough hands clenched tight. He had plowed fields, hauled timber, labored until sweat blurred his eyes. And for what? To live without ownership of himself. He felt the weight of it all pressing down, yet he also felt something rising, something he had never allowed himself to hope for until now. Freedom. When the jury returned, the room hushed to a silence so complete that even the scrape of their chairs seemed like thunder. Elizabeth lifted her chin, her eyes steady. She would meet the verdict head-on. The foreman rose, his voice measured but carrying. The decision was read aloud. Elizabeth and Brom were no longer slaves. The words hung in the air like music, like bells ringing across stars. For a moment, there was no sound but the echo of them. Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her bones. Freedom. After a lifetime of servitude, after nights filled with exhaustion and mornings heavy with command, she was free. A slow, quiet smile broke across her face, not one of triumph alone, but of peace, of dignity restored. Brom exhaled, a breath he had been holding his whole life. He straightened in his seat, shoulders rising, his entire body lighter than it had ever been. He looked at Elizabeth, and she at him, and in that shared glance was a bond forged by struggle and sealed by victory. They walked out of the courtroom that day not as property, but as people. The sky seemed brighter, the air sweeter, every sound and smell more vivid. Freedom was no longer a word overheard from the mouths of others. It was theirs. And if a single minute of it was so sweet, what must a lifetime be? The courtroom emptied, the farmers drifted back to their fields. But something irreversible had happened. The revolution's promise had been tested in the life of one woman and one man, and it had held true. From that wooden room in Great Barrington, the shockwaves spread across Massachusetts, ending slavery not through battle, but through the courage of Brom and Elizabeth, and the clarity of a jury that chose justice. Freedom did not mean isolation for Elizabeth Freeman. When the verdict released her from bondage, she chose a path both practical and profound. She entered the Sedgwick household, not as property, but as a paid servant and nurse. For the first time, she worked under her own will. Her hours still filled with tasks, her hands still busy, but every movement carried a new weight, the weight of choice. The Sedgwick home was alive with energy. Theodore Sedgwick, quick-minded and ambitious, filled its rooms with conversation and visitors. His children scampered through the halls, their laughter rising over the clatter of dishes and the murmur of guests. The household was not quiet, nor was it solemn. It was bright, noisy, full of the commotion of a family deeply engaged in both domestic life and the larger life of the young republic. Into this setting, Freeman brought more than labor. She brought steadiness, wisdom, and a strength that had been tested in harsher fires. The children adored her. They called her Mumbet, as the world still did, but with a new affection. She became a second mother to them, a constant presence who soothed fevers, mended scraped knees, and held them close when storms rattled the windows. Years later, one of the Sedgwick daughters would recall that Freeman's arms were the safest place in the world, strong and warm, a haven no one else could provide. With Theodore Sedgwick, her relationship was marked by respect. He had argued for her freedom, but now he witnessed firsthand the character of the woman he had defended. She was more than a client. She was a confidant within his home, a figure of trust and reliability. He saw how she managed the household with quiet authority, how her voice calmed disputes, how her presence steadied the rhythm of their days. There was no mistaking it, this was no ordinary servant. This was a woman whose dignity commanded regard. Freeman was not shy about speaking her mind. Though she worked within the Sedgwick home, she was no longer silenced. She gave advice, sometimes blunt, sometimes tender, and the family listened. She had earned her freedom in court, but she lived it daily in the way she carried herself. Within the Sedgwick household, she was not only serving, she was shaping. To live free, to work under her own terms, to be valued not as property but as a person, this was the triumph Elizabeth Freeman carried every day she spent in that lively home. As the years passed, her sense of freedom grew roots deeper than the wages she earned. She wanted more than to serve, even in the comfort of a respected family. She wanted her own hearth, her own walls, her own piece of the world that belonged to no one but her. And so she left, carrying with her not bitterness, but gratitude, and the desire to prove that a woman once enslaved could stand wholly independent. In Stockbridge, she bought a small house of her own. Modest, but sturdy, the scent of herbs growing in the garden, the smoke of her own fire rising into the sky. Within those walls, her days unfolded under her command. She rose with the sun, opened her door to neighbors, and welcomed those who sought her counsel. She was known for her healing hands, for her knowledge of remedies and herbs, for the way she could comfort the sick or ease a fever with quiet care. People came to her not as master to servant, but as friend to friend. Her life became a beacon in the community. She had taken the most fragile promise, that all men are born free and equal, and made it into something flesh and blood, something that could be lived. Others saw her and were reminded that liberty was not an abstraction. It was a woman who had been enslaved, who had stood in a courtroom, who had walked out free and never turned back. The Sedgwick children never forgot her. They visited her in her own home, seeking the comfort of her company even as they grew and scattered into the world. They carried with them the lessons she had taught, not only about kindness, but about courage, about the weight of words, about the meaning of dignity. One daughter would later say that the safest place in the world had been her arms, and that memory carried into their adulthood like a blessing. As she aged, her story became part of the fabric of Stockbridge itself. People spoke of her not as a former servant, but as Elizabeth Freeman, a woman respected for her wisdom and her strength. She moved through the town with quiet authority, known for the grace of her presence and the pride of her independence. Every scar she carried was part of her history, but every step she took on her own land was part of her triumph. She lived to see her children free. She lived to see Massachusetts confirm the precedent her case had set, a state where slavery withered under the weight of its own paradox. She lived to see the Revolution end, the colonies knit into a nation, a place still tangled in the sin of slavery, but one that had made room for her freedom. When she died in 1829, she was laid to rest not in a potter's field, not in an unmarked grave, but in the Sedgwick family plot, the only person outside their bloodline to be buried there. Her stone still stands, engraved with words that shine like the life she lived. She could neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere she had no superior or equal. It was not marble that made her great, nor books, nor titles, but the clarity of her conviction and the courage of her choice. Her legacy did not end with her grave. It lived on in the generations who carried her story, in the people who pointed to her life as proof that the words of freedom could not be contained. She was not a general, not a legislator, not a man of wealth or war. She was a woman who listened, who believed, who dared to speak. And in speaking, she altered the course of history. What does it mean that Elizabeth Freeman lived free and died free in a world that had been built on slavery? It means that liberty is never given, it is taken. It means that courage can blossom in kitchens and servant quarters as surely as in halls of power. It means that the revolution was not the work of soldiers alone, but also of women like Freeman, who carried its promise into the marrow of their bones. Her life is a lullaby of freedom, not soft with ease, but steady with resolve. It is the hum of footsteps along a dirt road, walking toward a lawyer's office with a heart full of fire. It is the echo of a jury foreman's voice declaring her free. It is the quiet joy of planting herbs in her own garden, of tending her own fire, of living her days as her own. And so our story closes. The candle burns low, the night deepens, but her spirit remains strong and unbroken. She was born enslaved, yet she died free. And in that arc is the sweetness of liberty itself. Thank you for listening to Historian's Lullaby. Good night.